Margaret Okonkwo adjusted her silk head wrap in the mirror, admiring how the imported fabric caught the afternoon light streaming through her mansion's windows. Everything about her screamed success. The marble floors shipped from Italy, the crystal chandelier that once hung in a Portuguese estate, the mahogany furniture carved by the finest craftsmen in Lagos. She had clawed her way from the dusty outskirts of Enugu to become the wife of Governor Okonkwo, and she wore her status like armor. "Mama, the invitations are ready," her housemaid announced, presenting a silver tray bearing cream-colored envelopes embossed with gold lettering. Margaret picked one up, running her manicured fingers across the elegant script. Her garden party, celebrating her daughter Adi's graduation from the University of London, would be the social event of the season. Politicians, business moguls, and the educated elite would gather on her perfectly manicured lawns. She'd spared no expense. Champagne from France, a live orchestra, imported roses that cost more than most families earned in a month. But Margaret had one more guest to invite. One that would provide the entertainment she craved. "Chinyu," she called to her personal assistant. "I need you to deliver an invitation, personally, to that herbalist woman." "What's her name?"
Nneka.
"The one who lives near the old market." Chinyu's eyebrows rose. "Mama Nneka? The traditional healer?" "Yes, that one." Margaret's lips curved into a smile that never reached her eyes. "I want her at my party. Tell her it's to honor local traditions alongside modern achievement. Make it sound sincere." Chinyu hesitated. "But Mama, everyone knows you don't believe in traditional medicine. Last month you called it primitive superstition at the Women's League meeting." "Exactly." Margaret's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "That's the point. Imagine, all my educated guests, my daughter fresh from London, and in walks this village woman with her leaves and roots and chants. My friends from the capital will find it amusing, a quaint reminder of what we've evolved beyond." What Margaret didn't say aloud was the deeper satisfaction she'd gain. For years, people had whispered that Mama Nneka possessed real wisdom, that even the wealthy sought her remedies in secret. Margaret wanted to prove, once and for all, that education and Western medicine had rendered such women obsolete. She wanted to humiliate the old ways in front of everyone who mattered. "Deliver today," Margaret commanded. "And make sure she understands this is a formal event. I want her to feel completely out of place." 3 hours later, Chinyu stood at the entrance of a modest compound near the old market. The contrast to Margaret's mansion couldn't have been starker. Here, chickens pecked at the red earth, and the scent of dried herbs hung heavy in the air. Clay pots lined the walls, each labeled in careful script. A small garden burst with plants Chinyu couldn't name, some with purple flowers, others with silvery leaves that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. Mama Nneka emerged from her workshop, wiping her hands on a cloth. She was perhaps 60, with deep lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent studying both plants and people. Her wrapper was simple but clean, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. Unlike Margaret's calculated elegance, Nneka carried a natural dignity that required no expensive fabric to announce itself. "Good evening, my daughter." Nneka greeted Chinyu warmly. "What brings you to my door?" Chinyu shifted uncomfortably, suddenly ashamed of her errand. "Mama Nneka, I come with an invitation. From Mrs. Margaret Okonkwo. She's hosting a garden party next Saturday and wishes for you to attend as an honored guest." Nneka's knowing eyes studied the envelope, then Chinyu's face. "Does she now?" "She said to tell you it's to honor local traditions alongside modern achievement," Chinyu recited, her voice small. A sad smile touched Nneka's lips. "And what do you think, child? Do you believe that's why she invites me?" Chinyu couldn't meet her gaze. I think she means to mock you, Mama."
"I'm sorry."
"I tried to tell her it was wrong. But she is your employer and you must eat." Nneka's voice held no judgment. "I understand." She took the invitation, turning it over in her weathered hands. "Tell Mrs. Okonkwo I accept her invitation. And tell her I will bring a gift appropriate for the occasion." "Mama, you don't have to go," Chinyu blurted. "She wants to embarrass you in front of important people. She's been planning it." Oh, I know exactly what she plans. Nneka's expression remained serene, but something flickered in her eyes, something ancient and knowing. But perhaps it is time for certain truths to bloom. Like the seeds I plant, some things must be buried in darkness before they can grow into the light. Chinyu left feeling unsettled, though she couldn't explain why. There was something in Mama Nneka's calm acceptance that seemed less like resignation and more like preparation. Back at the mansion, Margaret celebrated her small victory with a glass of wine. Her mother-in-law, Mama Blessing, sat in the corner of the veranda, as she did every evening, silent and still in her wheelchair. The old woman had suffered a stroke 6 months ago, or so the doctor said. Now she could barely move, couldn't speak, could only watch the world with clouded eyes that seemed to hold accusations Margaret refused to acknowledge. "Your party will be magnificent," Margaret's friend Vivian said, having stopped by for tea. "But darling, inviting that herbalist? Isn't that a bit eccentric?" "It's ironic," Margaret corrected. "My daughter returns with a degree in biochemistry, and I present a woman who treats illnesses with leaves. It's a visual metaphor for progress." Vivian laughed. "You're wicked, Margaret. I love it." They didn't notice Mama Blessing's fingers twitch slightly on her wheelchair's armrest. They didn't see the single tear that rolled down her weathered cheek. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the house had fallen silent, Margaret stood in her mother-in-law's room. She pulled a small vial from her jewelry box, a vial she refilled every 3 weeks from a supplier in Port Harcourt, a supplier who asked no questions as long as the money was good. "Just a few drops in your evening tea, Mama," Margaret whispered, adding the clear liquid to the cup on the bedside table. "To keep you peaceful. We can't have you recovering and telling tales, can we? Not when you know what I did to acquire this house. Not when you know whose land rights I forged to secure my husband's wealth." The old woman's eyes followed Margaret's movements, helpless and aware. Margaret had been administering the poison slowly for months, keeping her mother-in-law in a state of paralyzed silence. The inheritance from Mama Blessing's late husband's land that should have gone to his brother's children, had built this mansion, funded this lifestyle. And Margaret would ensure the truth stayed buried with the old woman. She had no idea that truth, like the seeds in Nneka's garden, was already beginning to sprout. The morning of the garden party arrived with crystalline clarity. Margaret's estate had been transformed into something from a magazine spread. White tents billowed in the gentle breeze, their interiors lined with gold chairs and tables draped in imported linen. The caterers had arrived at dawn, preparing delicacies that blended continental cuisine with Nigerian flavors. Jollof rice served in fine china, suya presented on silver platters, champagne flowing like water. Adiz, Margaret's daughter, stood near the fountain, looking uncomfortable in her designer dress. At 23, she had her mother's sharp features, but none of her hardness. London had exposed her to different perspectives, and coming home to her mother's ostentatious displays felt increasingly hollow. "Mama, do we really need all this?" Adiz asked as Margaret supervised the final arrangements. "Half the village doesn't have clean water, and we're serving champagne that costs." "That costs what we can afford," Margaret cut her off sharply. "I didn't sacrifice everything to give you opportunities just so you could come back speaking like a socialist. This party shows people who we are. It shows them what's possible. It shows them what you want them to think," Adiz muttered, but her mother had already moved on, barking orders at a server who'd placed a fork incorrectly. Guests began arriving at noon. Ministers in Agbada robes that cost small fortunes, their wives dripping with gold jewelry. University professors in crisp suits, discussing politics and policy. Business owners who controlled everything from telecommunications to oil imports. They air-kissed Margaret, complimented her taste, and settled into the garden with the ease of people accustomed to luxury. Margaret was in her element, floating between groups, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, touching arms with practiced intimacy. She had nearly forgotten about her special guest until Chinyu appeared at her elbow. "Mama, the herbalist is here." Margaret's eyes lit up. Perfect timing. "Show her in. Make sure everyone sees." Mama Nneka entered the garden carrying a woven basket covered with white cloth. She wore a traditional wrapper and blouse, clean but clearly homemade, her only jewelry a simple coral bead necklace. The contrast between her and the other guests was exactly what Margaret had orchestrated. Conversations dimmed as people noticed her. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Is that Mama Nneka? What is she doing here? How quaint. Margaret's really leaning into the cultural roots theme. Margaret glided forward, arms extended in exaggerated welcome. Mama Nneka, how wonderful that you could join us. Everyone, this is Mama Nneka, one of our community's traditional healers. I thought it important that Adi's celebration include representation of all aspects of our heritage, both the traditional and the modern. The condescension in her voice was thinly veiled. Several guests smiled knowingly. This was entertainment, the educated elite indulging the old ways with patronizing tolerance. Thank you for inviting me, Mrs. Okonkwo, Nneka replied calmly. I've brought a gift for your daughter and for this household. A special blend I've prepared. How thoughtful. Margaret's smile was plastic. Though I must tell you, Adiz is a scientist now. She understands pharmacology, clinical trials, empirical evidence. But I'm sure she'll appreciate this sentiment. A few guests chuckled. Adiz looked mortified. Nneka didn't flinch. Science and traditional knowledge need not be enemies, Mrs. Okonkwo. In fact, many modern medicines come from the plants our ancestors understood. But this gift is not medicine. It is something else. She reached into her basket and withdrew a clay pot, beautifully crafted and sealed with beeswax. This is ceremonial tea, made from herbs that have a special property. In my family, we call it truth bloom. We serve it at important gatherings, believing it helps people speak what is in their hearts. Margaret's laugh was sharp. How charming. A truth serum from leaves. You see, everyone? This is what I mean about the gap between superstition and science. Perhaps, Nneka said quietly. But humor me. In your culture, Mrs. Okonkwo, when honoring a child's achievement, is it not customary for the elders to share wisdom? To speak truths that guide the next generation? She was boxing Margaret in with tradition. Refusing now would seem disrespectful in front of guests who, despite their Western education, still held certain cultural practices sacred. Of course, Margaret said tightly. We can certainly indulge in a ceremonial tea. It's all part of the experience, isn't it? Nneka smiled. Wonderful. The preparation is simple. It must be brewed fresh and served immediately. With your permission, I'll prepare it in your kitchen. It takes only a few minutes to steep. Margaret waved dismissively. Chinyu, show her to the kitchen. We'll gather everyone for this ceremony in 10 minutes. As Nneka left, Margaret turned to her guests with an eye roll. I hope you all appreciate the lengths I go to for authenticity, she joked. They laughed with her, delighted by the spectacle. Only Adiz noticed her grandmother, Mama Blessing, being wheeled onto the veranda by a nurse. The old woman's presence at the party had been Margaret's idea, a prop to demonstrate family unity. But something in her grandmother's eyes caught Adiz's attention. For someone supposedly incapacitated by a stroke, Mama Blessing seemed remarkably alert, her gaze fixed on the kitchen door where Nneka had disappeared. 10 minutes later, Nneka emerged carrying a large ceramic teapot and matching cups on a wooden tray. The tea itself was a rich amber color, fragrant with herbs, lemongrass, ginger, and something else Adiz couldn't identify. Something that smelled like earth after rain, like things buried coming to surface. The tradition, Nneka explained as guests gathered, is for the elders to drink first, then share their wisdom with the young. After that, the honored child drinks and finally, any guest who wishes to participate. Margaret preened. This was perfect. She'd drink the silly tea, say something profound-sounding, and the whole thing would make her seem both gracious and culturally connected. I'll start then, Margaret announced, taking the first cup. She sipped, expecting something bitter, but the tea was actually quite pleasant, smooth, warming, with a subtle sweetness. Delicious, she admitted, surprised. You see? Not everything traditional is unpalatable. More laughter from her audience. Nneka poured cups for other guests. The governor drank. Several ministers. The university chancellor. Vivian. Even Adiz, after a moment's hesitation, accepted a cup. Now, Nneka said softly, according to tradition, those who have drunk should speak a truth from their hearts. Something they wish the young to know. Who would like to begin? Margaret set down her cup, ready to deliver a prepared speech about hard work and ambition. But as she opened her mouth, something strange happened. The words that came out weren't the ones she'd planned. I'll tell you what I want Adiz to know, Margaret heard herself saying, her voice seeming to come from somewhere outside herself. I want her to know that success requires sacrifice. Sometimes you have to bury the inconvenient to build the magnificent. The words hung in the air. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. That wasn't quite the inspirational message they'd expected. Margaret blinked, confused. Why had she said that? She tried to laugh it off. What I mean is... But Nneka was watching her with those ancient eyes, and Margaret suddenly felt cold despite the afternoon heat. The tea opens the heart, Mrs. Okonkwo, Nneka said gently. Please continue. Tell us about the sacrifices you've made. And to Margaret's absolute horror, she felt her mouth opening again, words spilling out like water from a broken dam, words she'd never meant to say aloud. The biggest sacrifice, Margaret continued, unable to stop herself, was making sure certain people stayed silent. You can't build an empire when someone knows where the cracks in the foundation are. The garden had gone deathly quiet. Guests exchanged confused glances. Adiz's face had gone pale. Mama, what are you talking about? Her daughter asked. Margaret's hands flew to her mouth, but the words kept coming, pushing past her fingers like something alive and desperate to escape. The land. Your grandfather's land. It wasn't supposed to be ours. It belonged to his brother's family, but I forged the documents. Changed the inheritance. The sale of that land built this house, funded everything. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The governor stood abruptly, his face ashen. Margaret, stop talking. But that wasn't enough, Margaret continued, tears streaming down her face now, her voice rising in pitch as panic set in. Because she knew. Mama Blessing knew what I'd done. She threatened to tell everyone, to ruin us. So, I found a solution. All eyes turned to where Mama Blessing sat in her wheelchair, the old woman's eyes now blazing with something that looked like vindication. What solution? Adiz whispered, though she seemed terrified of the answer. The stroke wasn't a stroke. Margaret's voice broke. I've been poisoning her. Slowly. Small doses every day in her tea. Just enough to keep her paralyzed, unable to speak, unable to expose what I'd done. The doctor in Port Harcourt provides the compounds. He thinks it's for pest control. I've been killing her by inches for 6 months. The garden erupted. Women screamed. Men shouted. The governor grabbed his wife's arm, his face a mask of fury and fear. You did what? You've been poisoning my mother. But the tea's effect wasn't finished. Other guests who had drunk were beginning to speak unbidden truths of their own. The university chancellor suddenly blurted, I take bribes from wealthy families to guarantee their children's admissions. A prominent minister stood, his voice loud with confession. I've embezzled 30 million naira from the education fund meant for rural schools. Vivian, Margaret's closest friend, started sobbing. I knew about the poisoning. Margaret told me 2 months ago when she was drunk. I said nothing because I wanted to keep my place in this social circle. It was chaos. People were trying to leave, but they couldn't seem to stop talking, couldn't stop revealing the secrets they'd buried. Nneka stood at the center of it all, calm as still water, watching the truth bloom exactly as she'd promised. Adiz ran to her grandmother's wheelchair, kneeling beside it. Grandma, is this true? Has she been poisoning you? Mama Blessing's mouth worked, and for the first time in months, words emerged, hoarse, broken, but unmistakable. Yes, all true. Wanted to tell you, couldn't. Security guards had started moving toward Margaret, but she wasn't trying to run. She'd collapsed onto the perfectly manicured grass, her silk gown spreading around her like blood and water, still talking, still confessing. I did it all for this, she wept.
To matter. To be somebody.
I came from nothing, a village nobody would remember. I couldn't go back to that. I wouldn't. So, I buried anyone who stood in my way. Adiz turned to Nneka, her voice shaking. What was in that tea? What did you do? Nneka's expression was compassionate but firm. I told no lies, daughter. The herbs I used do encourage people to speak what is in their hearts. But truth cannot be forced from those who carry none. What you're witnessing is not magic, it's the weight of secrets that have festered too long. I simply provided the opening for them to escape. But how did you know? Adiz demanded. How did you know about my mother? Because 6 months ago, your grandmother came to me, Nneka said quietly. Before she became too sick to walk. She told me her daughter-in-law was acting strangely, that her tea tasted different. She suspected poison, but had no proof. I tested the samples she brought me and found traces of compounds meant to paralyze the nervous system. I've been preparing for this day ever since. You could have gone to the police, Adiz said. Could I? Nneka's eyebrow raised. Would they have believed a traditional healer over the governor's wife? Would they have tested a wealthy woman based on the word of an old village woman and someone they consider a practitioner of superstition? Or would your mother have simply killed Mama Blessing faster, before anyone could prove anything? The logic was undeniable. Adiz felt her world tilting on its axis. The governor was on his phone now, calling for a doctor, calling for the police, his voice thick with rage and shame. His political career was likely over. The revelation that his wife had poisoned his own mother would destroy him by association, regardless of his innocence. Why did you invite me here? Nneka asked Margaret, who had finally stopped talking, her confessions exhausted. You wanted to humiliate me in front of your educated friends. You wanted to prove that the old ways were foolish, that people like me were relics of a primitive past. Margaret couldn't even look at her. But the old ways aren't about leaves and roots and chance, Nneka continued, her voice carrying across the destroyed garden party. They're about understanding that some truths run deeper than the lies we tell ourselves. They're about knowing that what you bury in darkness will eventually find the light. You mock tradition because you fear what it represents, accountability to something larger than your own ambition. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Nneka turned to Adiz, who stood trembling beside her grandmother's wheelchair. Your mother asked me to bring a gift appropriate for the occasion. I brought the truth. What you do with it now is your choice. What happens to my grandmother? Adiz asked. Can you help her recover? With time and proper treatment, yes. The poison hasn't been in her system long enough to cause permanent damage. But she'll need care, support, and distance from the person who harmed her. Adiz nodded, tears streaming down her face. Her expensive London education hadn't prepared her for this. None of her biochemistry classes had taught her about the kind of poison that came from human greed. As the police vehicles pulled up to the estate, as officers began taking statements and arresting not just Margaret, but several of the guests who had confessed to crimes, Nneka quietly packed her basket. The garden party had become a crime scene, white tents now marking not celebration but catastrophe. Mama Nneka, Adiz called as the herbalist prepared to leave. Thank you. For saving my grandmother. For showing me the truth. Nneka's smile was gentle. I only planted seeds, child. Your grandmother's strength kept her alive long enough for them to grow. And your own integrity will determine what grows from this painful harvest. She walked toward the gate, past the chaos, past the weeping and the accusations, past the ruin of Margaret's gilded empire. Behind her, Mama Blessing reached up with trembling fingers to grasp her granddaughter's hand, squeezing weakly. The old woman's eyes were clear now, no longer clouded by poison. She had survived. The truth had survived. And Margaret Okonkwo, who had sacrificed everything for a beautiful lie, was led away in handcuffs, her silk headwrap askew, her makeup running, all her carefully constructed dignity dissolved like sugar in rain. The magnificent mansion would be seized. The stolen inheritance would be returned. The elaborate lifestyle would crumble. But in a modest compound near the old market, Mama Nneka would return to her herbs and her clay pots, to the simple dignity that required no expensive fabric to announce itself. Some gardens, after all, grew truth instead of roses. 3 months later, Adiz sat in Mama Nneka's compound, grinding herbs under the older woman's patient instruction. The scent of morina and neem filled the air, earthy and clean. It was nothing like the imported perfumes her mother had favored, but Adiz found it infinitely more honest. "You're improving," Nneka observed, checking the consistency of the paste. "Your biochemistry training actually helps. You understand the compounds in ways I learned through observation and tradition." Adiz smiled faintly. She'd withdrawn from university. Not permanently, she told herself, just for now. Everything had changed after that disastrous garden party. Her father had resigned from his position as governor, the scandal too overwhelming to survive politically. He'd moved to a modest house in Abuja, trying to rebuild a life separate from his wife's crimes. He called Adiz weekly, his voice heavy with guilt for not seeing what was happening under his own roof. Margaret was in prison, awaiting trial for attempted murder, fraud, and forgery. Adiz had visited her once. Her mother had aged a decade in 3 months, all her artificial polish stripped away by prison uniform and harsh lighting. She'd begged for forgiveness, claimed she'd done it all for her family, insisted she'd only wanted to give Adiz opportunities. Adiz hadn't visited again. Some wounds needed distance to heal. "How is Mama blessing today?" Nneka asked, as she did every time Adiz came for her lessons. "Stronger. She walked to the market yesterday without her cane. The doctors are amazed by her recovery." Adiz paused in her grinding. "They keep asking what you did, what treatment you used. They don't believe it was just herbs and thyme." "It was herbs, thyme, and removal from the source of poison," Nneka corrected. "The body has remarkable capacity to heal when we stop harming it. But the doctors won't accept that answer. They need it to be complicated, to involve expensive equipment and pharmaceutical interventions." "Some of them are genuinely interested," Adiz offered. "Dr. Obi asked if you'd consider partnering with a university hospital, combining traditional knowledge with clinical research." Nneka's eyes lit up. Now that would be something. Not me teaching them, not them dismissing me, but actual collaboration. "What did you tell him?" "That I'd ask you." Adiz resumed grinding. "But Mama Nneka, I have to know that tea. The truth tea. Did it really work the way everyone thinks?" The older woman was quiet for a moment, tending to a plant with purple flowers. "What do you think?" "I think." Adiz chose her words carefully. "I think people confess for many reasons. Guilt. Fear. The desire to finally be free of secrets. I think you created a situation where confession felt inevitable, where the social pressure and ceremonial setting made people vulnerable to their own consciences." "And," Nneka prompted, "and I think there might have been something in the tea that lowered inhibitions. Something that made it harder to maintain the walls we build around uncomfortable truths. But I don't think it was magic. I think it was psychology and pharmacology working together." Nneka smiled broadly. "You see? This is why the old ways and the new ways need each other. You're absolutely right. The tea contained mild compounds that reduce anxiety and lower social inhibitions, things that make it difficult to maintain lies when you're already feeling guilty. But it only worked on people who carried guilt. Your mother drank it already burdened by her crimes. The tea didn't create her confession. It simply made it harder for her to carry the weight alone." "And the others?" "The minister who confessed to embezzlement. He was already terrified. There were audits beginning, investigations starting. The tea gave him permission to speak what he already wanted to release." Nneka's expression grew serious. "Truth doesn't need magic to exist, Adiz. It only needs an opening. I provided the opening. Their consciences did the rest." Adiz absorbed this, understanding that Nneka had used wisdom far older than chemistry, the wisdom of knowing that most people want to be freed from their lies, if only someone gives them a way out. "Do you regret it?" Adiz asked suddenly. "Destroying my family?" "I didn't destroy your family, child. Your mother's choices did that." Nneka's voice was gentle but firm. If I had done nothing, your grandmother would be dead within months. The lies would have continued. The stolen land would have remained stolen. And you would have built your life on a foundation of blood and betrayal, never knowing the truth. But now I have nothing. No father in politics, no mother at home, no inheritance, no status. You have truth, Nneka interrupted. You have your grandmother, who loves you. You have your integrity, which you chose to keep when you could have denied the evidence. You have knowledge from two worlds, the scientific and the traditional. These are not nothing, Adiz. These are everything. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the sound of grinding herbs and birds calling in the garden. The land your mother stole, Nneka said after a while. It's been returned to the rightful family. Did you know that? Adiz nodded. My father insisted on it, even though it bankrupted him to return the money from the sale. He said it was the only way to sleep at night. Your father is a good man who married a woman with a hungry ghost inside her. Not everyone can tell the difference between ambition and greed until it's too late. Nneka wiped her hands on her wrapper. The family who received their land back? They want to thank you. They know you gave up your inheritance voluntarily to make things right. I didn't give up anything, Adiz said firmly. It was never mine to begin with. Nneka's smile was proud. That understanding, that is the difference between you and your mother. She believed she deserved what she could take. You understand that deserving requires earning. As the sun began to set, painting the compound in shades of amber and gold, Adiz thought about her future. She would return to university eventually, finish her degree. But now she had a different goal. Not just to escape poverty like her mother had, but to bridge worlds. To prove that science and tradition could work together, that progress didn't require abandoning roots. Mama Nneka, she said quietly, will you teach me? Really teach me? Everything you know? Everything I know would take a lifetime to share, Nneka replied. But yes, I'll teach you what I can. On one condition. What's that? You teach me too. Show me how to document these herbs scientifically, how to test them properly, how to translate traditional knowledge into a language that can help more people. Together, we'll plant seeds of a different kind. Not deception, but wisdom. Not lies, but healing. Adiz extended her hand, and Nneka clasped it firmly. Outside the compound, the city continued its frantic pace. Cars honking, markets bustling, people chasing success and status, and all the glittering prizes that seemed to matter so much. But here, in this quiet garden where truth had once bloomed to devastating effect, two women began planting something new. Seeds of tomorrow, grown in soil enriched by the hard lessons of yesterday. And unlike Margaret's mansion or her stolen wealth, unlike her silk headwraps and crystal chandeliers, these seeds would grow into something lasting, something real, something that couldn't be destroyed by the revelation of its origins, because it was built on truth from the very beginning. Mama Blessing would visit next week, strong enough now to walk without assistance, her voice returned, her dignity restored. The three of them, grandmother, granddaughter, and healer, would share tea. Real tea this time, with nothing but herbs and honey and the sweetness of second chances. And if anyone asked Mama Nneka about that garden party, about the tea that had destroyed the governor's wife, she would simply smile and say, I only showed people what was already growing in the darkness of their hearts. Truth needs no magic to bloom. It only needs light.